She was hired to balance the books of a ranch that was falling apart from the inside out, and she left with a heart fuller than she ever imagined possible. Can you imagine arriving at a place carrying a small suitcase, immense pride, and the absolute certainty that it was just a job, that you were going to walk in, do exactly what you knew how to do, and leave without leaving anything behind but organized numbers and perfectly aligned columns? Well, that is exactly how Nora Lewis arrived at the Whispering Winds Ranch in March of 1924, deep in the Texas plains. She didn't know on that afternoon, smelling of wet earth and freshly cut sweetgrass, that the red dirt road leading up to the heavy wooden gate was going to change absolutely everything she thought about herself, about the world, and about what the human heart is capable of holding when we least expect it. But before I tell you this story, I need to ask you for something very important. Leave a comment down below telling me where you're watching from, the name of your city and your state. It seems simple, but this gesture makes a huge difference so that this channel can keep bringing stories like this to more people. Each comment is a way of saying you are here, that these stories matter, and that warms my heart. Also, please like this video because it really helps bring this story to more folks who deserve to hear it. Now sit down with me, because this story deserves to be told calmly and with all the care it holds. Nora grew up listening to the sound of a pencil on paper, not the sound of schoolyard laughter or party music, nor the sound of warehouse doors or a pot bubbling on the stove. It was a different sound, almost musical in its own way, the specific scratch of a well-sharpened pencil gliding over heavy stock paper while someone added, subtracted, multiplied, and found out exactly where the money had gone. That was the sound of the Lewis household. Her father's office door left half open, and Arthur Lewis bent over his dark oak desk, wearing round spectacles and a jacket worn thin at the elbows, working with the silent concentration of a man who treats numbers as if they had a life of their own and demanded respect. Ever since she was a little girl, Nora would stand on the threshold of that office and just watch. She didn't go in without being called, because she understood early on that this was a sacred space in a very particular way, a place where things needed to be quiet and precise in order to be true. But she would stand there, barefoot on the hardwood hallway that creaked in one specific spot near the corridor dresser, learning through pure observation what no school taught young women in those days. She learned that a ledger does not lie, that numbers are the most honest story a place can tell about itself, that when the columns don't balance, something is wrong somewhere, and the job of someone who knows how to look is to find out exactly where. By the time she was 12, she already understood more about accounting than many grown men her father served as clients. At 15, she began helping him with the audits, sitting on the other side of that same oak desk with her own notebook. At 20, she was doing alone what used to take the two of them. Arthur Lewis was a discreet and meticulous man who was never rich but never owed anything to anyone either, and he treated his daughter with a seriousness that sometimes baffled their neighbors in Clarendon, who thought it odd for a father to teach a daughter what he should be teaching a son. Arthur never cared about what the neighbors thought. He said Nora's mind was far too good to be wasted on frivolities, and that the world, sooner or later, was going to need what she knew how to do. He said this with the quiet conviction of a man who believes in the simple things he says. What he couldn't have known was that he wouldn't be alive to see it happen. Arthur Lewis died on a Wednesday in July 1922, at 52 years of age, from a fever that arrived quietly and simply refused to leave. Nora was 25. She sat by her father's bed for 5 days straight, changing out cold water compresses and listening to a breath that grew shallower with each passing hour. When he finally left, it was early morning, with the orange light just filtering through the bedroom window and a sparrow singing outside, as if the world didn't know it had completely changed. She stayed quiet for a long moment, her hands resting over his already cooling hands, and then she slowly stood up, walked to the office, opened the ledgers, and began to understand the sheer size of what had been left behind. The debts weren't absurd, but they were real and precise, much like the numbers her father had taught her to respect. Arthur was careful, but the last few years had been hard for an independent worker in West Texas, and there were small loans scattered in various places, 2 months of back rent, bills that had been postponed with the sincere hope of better times that simply never arrived. Nora added it all up with the aching calm of someone who prefers knowing over not knowing, and when she closed the final ledger that night, with the kerosene lamp smelling strong and the whole house quiet around her, she knew exactly where she stood. She also knew she needed to work. Not in a little while, not after a mourning period, not whenever she felt ready. She needed to work right now, with the concrete urgency of someone whose obligations do not wait for feelings. For 2 years, she did what she could with what she had. She worked for a merchant in Amarillo, reviewing his monthly warehouse books, a job that paid little but was honest. She helped a small-time rancher who couldn't figure out why his accounts never balanced, discovering in 2 hours of analysis that his youngest son was skimming from the register and doctoring the intake sums. She took on odd bookkeeping jobs for 2 county clerk's offices and a pharmacy. In doing so, she earned a quiet but solid reputation among those who needed that kind of service. Nora Lewis knew what she was doing. She was fast, and the numbers she audited didn't come back with problems. But none of those jobs were enough. None paid well enough for her to actually breathe easy, to sleep without calculating, to wake up without the constant shadow of the next bill coming due. It was on a warm afternoon in February 1924, sitting on the porch of the boarding house where she lived in Amarillo, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold because she forgot to drink it, that she heard 2 women talking in the indoor hallway. They were talking about the Whispering Winds Ranch. They said the manager had packed up and left in a hurry, without notice, without explanation, overnight. They said the owner of the ranch, a man named Garrett Drummond, had been without anyone to handle the books and the administration for 3 weeks, and that he was having a hard time finding a replacement. They said it was the largest ranch in the Panhandle region, with cattle and crops, and a main house that drew envy from miles away. They also said Drummond was difficult, closed off, the type who didn't repeat himself twice, and had 0 patience for explaining the obvious. One of them commented that the pay was good, but the boss wasn't easy, and that no man in town wanted the job because of it. The other replied that no man in town would have the guts to take on the mess the former manager had left behind, regardless of the salary. Nora sat listening with the cold cup in her hand. Then she sat thinking. And by the time the sun dipped away that evening and the boarding house began filling with the smell of supper, she had made a decision that, from the outside, might have looked like courage. On the inside, it tasted different. More bitter, more urgent, the very specific taste of necessity when it finally aligns with the right direction. The next day, early in the morning, before the boarding house coffee was even ready, she began packing her suitcase. It wasn't a naive decision. Nora knew perfectly well that the women talking in the hall probably thought, as most people thought back then, that no woman would ever be hired for a position like that. She knew this possibility was real and concrete, and there was no use pretending it wasn't. But she also knew she understood accounting and ranch management better than most of the men who might show up for that vacancy, and that sometimes the only way to prove it is to show up, look the decision-maker in the eye, and see what happens. She had done it before on smaller scales. There was always a moment when people stopped seeing what they expected to see and started seeing what was actually right in front of them. She had learned to be patient for that moment. The journey from Amarillo to Whispering Winds took almost the entire day. One part by train, smelling of coal and the clatter of iron wheels on the tracks. One part by wagon with a laconic teamster headed the right way, who left her at a crossroads with the tip of his hat. The final stretch she walked on foot down a red dirt road that snaked between open pastures and dense brush, with the late afternoon sun hitting her from the side, making the rocks on the path cast long, stretching shadows. March on the Texas prairie has a specific scent Nora remembered from childhood and had lost while living in the city. The spring rains make the wild grass grow tall and dark green. The red dirt becomes rich and almost fragrant after the afternoon heat. And the air has a quality that is dense yet clean, heavy with the smell of wild sage, wet earth, and something harder to name, which is simply the smell of the plains existing the way they always have, enormous, silent, and full of living things. She arrived at the gates of Whispering Winds with her shoes dusted red, her hair pinned back more firmly than when she had left that morning, and an expression she had trained through years of hard work, neutral, direct, asking for nothing and owing nothing. The gate was made of heavy, weather-darkened wood, with the ranch's name carved into the top planks in broad letters that the wind and rain had softened but not erased. On the other side, an avenue of large, ancient trees, towering live oaks and pecans that had to be at least 50 years old, led up to the main house, which sat elevated on a gentle rise, seeming to look out over everything around it with the tranquility of something built to last. The house was large, with freshly whitewashed walls and a red tile roof, boasting a long front porch holding 2 wooden rocking chairs that, at that moment, were empty. The corrals sat further to the right, and Nora could hear the low lowing of cattle and the distant sound of men working, voices blending with the clatter of tools and the bark of a dog that had noticed someone at the gate. A ranch hand came to the gate. He was a middle-aged man named Jeb, a frayed straw hat on his head, and the expression of someone who works hard and has no spare time for idle chat. He looked Nora over with that silent appraisal she knew all too well, the suitcase, the shoes, the face, the posture, and she waited quiet, not trying to rush the process. She said she was there to speak to Mr. Garrett Drummond about the manager position. Jeb stood still for a moment, then told her to wait there, returning 4 minutes later to tell her she could come inside. Inside, the house felt larger than it looked from the exterior, bearing that spacious, slightly severe feel of homes built for endurance rather than to impress. There was a long central hallway with doors on both sides, hardwood floors darkened by time and use, and plaster walls that held the cool of the day even when the sun outside was high. The hand led her to a room at the back of the house that served as an office, a large desk in the center covered in stacks of paper that weren't exactly organized, solid wood bookcases lining the walls, filled with thick-bound volumes, and 2 unlit kerosene lamps waiting for nightfall. The room smelled of aged paper, leather bindings, and a faint trail of tobacco that hung in the air like the memory of someone who smoked while they worked. Garrett Drummond had his back to the door when she walked in, standing in front of the window, looking out over the pasture, arms loosely crossed, and his gaze lost on some distant point she couldn't see from the doorway. He was a tall man, with broad shoulders, shaped by a lifetime of carrying actual weight, possessing the kind of posture that comes not from arrogance, but from habit and accumulated responsibility. When he turned around, Nora got the immediate impression of someone who had once been young but decided, at some specific point in life, to stop acting young long before nature usually demands it. He was in his early 30s, his face weathered by the sun, in a way that spoke less of age and more of experience, dark eyebrows, and a gaze that wasn't hostile but was absolutely direct. The kind that makes no effort to be polite when politeness isn't what the situation requires. He looked at her for a second and a half. It was an involuntary look, the kind of pause that happens when reality doesn't match the picture expectation had drawn. There was nothing offensive about it. It was simply a recalibration. And then he said, in the deep, measured voice of someone who chooses his words before using them just as he chooses his tools before a job, that she was probably in the wrong place. Nora replied that she wasn't. She calmly stated that she had come for the manager position, that she knew the vacancy was open, and that she was there to be evaluated like any other candidate. Garrett remained silent for a moment, a silence she didn't try to fill. Then he pointed to the chair across the desk and told her to sit down. What happened over the next 40 minutes was unlike anything Nora had expected when she packed her suitcase that morning. She had prepared to be dismissed right off the bat, without a real chance. She had prepared to have to insist, to have to argue against the resistance of someone who didn't want to be convinced. What she hadn't expected was for Garrett Drummond to ask questions. Real, technical, highly specific questions, the kind that reveal the person asking understands enough to know when the answer is right. He asked about inventory control methods for cattle feed and supplies. He asked how she would calculate the net return on a corn harvest, taking into account the previous year's overhead costs plus market price variations. He asked what she would do if she found a 16% discrepancy between the incoming goods ledger and the outgoing usage log. Nora answered everything. She answered with the specific calm of someone who knows what she knows and requires no approval to validate that knowledge. Sometimes she expanded beyond what he asked, not to show off, but because the complete answer was more honest and more useful than a short, tidy one. At some point, without her being able to pinpoint exactly when it happened, she realized he had stopped testing her and had started genuinely listening. There is a subtle but unmistakable difference in the quality of attention between a man who is verifying and a man who is truly listening, and she recognized it. When she finished answering the last question, Garrett stayed quiet for a few seconds, looking down at the desk. Then he said he had one condition. Nora waited. He said the Whispering Winds Ranch had no room for complications, that the work was the work and needed to be treated as such, without giving the ranch hands any reason to gossip, without any confusion about what was what. He said this directly and without unnecessary delicacy, like someone who prefers the discomfort of a clear boundary over the comfort of an ambiguity that creates problems later. Nora understood exactly what was being said and replied with the same objectivity, that she was there out of genuine necessity, not as a hobby, that she had a job to do and had no interest in anything other than doing it well. Garrett looked at her for a moment. She couldn't quite classify. And then he stated the salary amount, told her she would have a room in the back quarters of the main house with meals included, and that she would start on Monday. Nora said she would start the next morning. There was a brief pause, and she got the quick, uncertain impression that something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It didn't quite reach a smile, but it was the idea of one, lasting less than a second. He said that was fine then. Miss Josephine appeared in the doorway moments later, as if she'd been waiting just outside, which was probably the truth, and led Nora to the back room. She was a woman in her early 50s, short and solidly built, with grey hair pulled back into a firm, unadorned bun, and hands that looked like they had been created specifically for labor. Broad, strong, knuckles marked by years over the stove and out in the yard. She had the quiet demeanor of someone who observes more than she speaks, and Nora realized from the very first moment, with the specific instinct of someone who is also a natural observer, that this woman saw far more than anyone would suspect from her silence. The room was simple and clean, with the kind of cleanliness that comes from true habit, not special preparation. A small window looked out onto the backyard, where peach trees grew alongside a massive, ancient weeping willow, with a trunk so thick it would take 2 adults to reach around it. A wooden bed with a straw mattress covered in white linen, a 3-drawer dresser, a small mirror hung on the wall by 2 nails, a hook for hanging clothes. It was more than Nora had in Amarillo, and she set her suitcase on the floor with that specific sensation that wasn't exactly relief, but was a close relative of it. The kind that comes when urgency pauses for a moment and leaves room to breathe. Josephine showed her where the kitchen was, the outhouse in the back, where the firewood was stacked, and said with a neutrality completely void of harshness that breakfast was at 6, and that after 6 it got cold. Nora thanked her and asked which office held the account ledgers. The cook looked at her for a second with dark, highly attentive eyes. She said it was the same room where she had just spoken with the boss, and that the ledgers were on the left side bookshelf, the last 3 years kept right in the front. And then she added, almost like someone finishing an unimportant practical thought, that the last 3 ledgers were the ones with the most problems. Nora stared at her. She asked if Josephine understood accounting. The cook said she didn't understand numbers. She said that when a man's face changes every time he opens certain books, anyone paying attention knows there's a problem in those books. She said this and walked back toward the kitchen without further ceremony. Nora stood in the hallway for a moment, watching the cooks retreating back, with something very close to respect settling inside her. The next morning, the grandfather clock in the parlor struck 6:30, and Nora had been sitting at the office desk for almost an hour. She had arrived at 5:40 while the house still slept, and the only sound was the call of a meadowlark on a branch in the yard, drank a cup of coffee she'd found on Josephine's already cooled stove. She'd arrived too early for hot coffee, just as she was warned, and since then she had been buried in the ledgers with the complete concentration that was her natural state whenever there was real work to be done. The east-facing window let in the morning light at a low, golden angle, illuminating the open pages of the ledgers as if it knew they were important. The account books of the Whispering Winds Ranch were, technically speaking, a highly specific work of disorganization, and it was exactly that specificity that was frightening. It wasn't sloppiness. It was a deliberate organization designed to make it difficult to see the whole picture, fragmenting the records in a way where each isolated piece looked reasonable, every individual number defensible, but the entirety of it failed to balance when you had enough patience and method to assemble the full image. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. They knew enough about accounting to hide inside it. Nora opened the first book, then the second, then the third, and she began building with the meticulous patience her father had taught her was a good accountant's most important tool, a picture of what had happened in there. She didn't try to rush. Rushing with numbers is the surest way to reach the wrong conclusion. It took her all day. She didn't stop for lunch and only went to get a glass of water in the early afternoon when she realized she had a headache from concentrating so hard. When Garrett appeared in the office doorway around 5 o'clock that evening, she was still hunched over the ledgers, 3 loose sheets of paper resting in front of her, covered in her small, highly precise handwriting. He stopped in the doorway. He watched her for a moment before coming in. She noticed his reflection in the window glass, where his silhouette appeared, and paused. Then he walked in and asked if she had found anything. Nora lifted her eyes from the paper. She said yes. She said it would be best if he sat down. Garrett came in, but he didn't sit immediately. He stood on the other side of the desk, arms crossed over his chest, and watched her as she began explaining what she had found. She explained with the direct clarity of someone who sees no use in softening the truth, nor in exaggerating the severity. The total missing amount, how the records had been manipulated, during which periods the discrepancies were largest, and what that meant in terms of the ranch's actual financial standing right at that moment. She didn't use soft words to cushion the numbers. She laid out what was there. When she finished, the silence that followed carried a different weight than ordinary silence. Garrett stared at the papers on the desk for a while. Then he raised his eyes to her, and for an instant, just one, brief as a blink. Nora saw something he probably didn't show often. It wasn't anger nor surprise, but the heavy, exhausted recognition of someone confirming a suspicion he had spent months hoping he was wrong about. He asked how long it would take to map out the entire picture. She said she would have the complete picture and a preliminary plan in a week. He said that was fine. He said goodnight and walked out. Nora spent another hour organizing her notes for the day. When she blew out the lamp and headed toward her room, the smell of the prairie night was drifting through the open hallway window with a tranquility she hadn't expected to feel so soon. It wasn't happiness yet. It was something simpler and more necessary. It was the feeling of being in the right place, doing the right thing. It was the feeling of using what she knew for something that truly mattered. She slept well for the first time in months. Her first week at Whispering Winds had the dense texture of a river during flood season. There was so much to do that time didn't seem to pass. It seemed to rush. Nora arrived at the office before sunrise and stayed until after supper, when the lamps had long been lit and the noise of the ranch had died down to the nocturnal silence of resting cattle and living brush. She mapped every credit and debit over the last 4 years, line by line, with the patience of someone who knows the devil is in the details, and the details never reveal themselves to someone in a hurry. What Ernest Vance, that was the full name of the manager who had left, had done during his 3 years, there hadn't been clumsy. That was precisely what made the damage so extensive. He had operated in the margins, in small deviations that individually looked like rounding adjustments or natural recording errors, but added up over time to represent a figure the ranch could ill afford to lose. There were cattle sales, logged in the outgoing books, that never hit the ranch's bank account. There were supply purchases noted with subtle duplication, slightly different amounts in different ledgers that contradicted each other side by side, but looked perfectly normal when viewed separately. There were payments to suppliers that, when Nora tracked them down in the contracts filed in the second drawer, corresponded to no real vendor with an actual contract. By the 5th day, she had a complete diagnosis. By the 6th, she had the draft of a plan. It was on a Saturday afternoon that Garrett walked into the office and found her with 2 large sheets of paper spread open across the desk. She had asked Josephine for butcher paper early that morning, briefly explaining what she needed it for, and on it she had drawn a sort of map of the ranch's financial flow using different colors for each category of income and expense, with arrows pointing to exactly where the bleeding had occurred. It was an ugly, functional document, the kind built for understanding, not impressing. Garrett stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the map before looking at her. And there was something in his expression that was hard to quickly classify, a mix of concentrated attention and something more reflective, quieter, like someone seeing a thing they never expected to see. He sat on the other side of the desk and listened as she presented it. Nora spoke for nearly an hour. She laid out the complete diagnosis of the current situation, followed by the recovery plan. Which expenses could be cut without hurting operations, which revenue streams could be optimized, and the priority order of problems to solve to stabilize cash flow before even thinking about growth. Garrett asked questions during the presentation, good questions that revealed he understood the ranch from the dirt up. He knew where every animal was, how much every process cost, which part of the operation was most sensitive to cuts and which could afford to wait. They disagreed twice during the conversation, once over the pace of reducing a certain feed expense, the other over the priority of a corral infrastructure investment he wanted to postpone, and she felt they couldn't. In both cases, they reached a middle ground that Nora internally recognized as better than either of their original proposals. By the time they finished, the sun was low, and the office was bathed in the golden half-light of a Texas late afternoon, that specific light that turns everything slightly copper. Garrett sat in silence for a moment, looking at the map she had drawn. Then he said the plan was good. He said it directly, without flourish, without the kind of exaggerated praise that is often more condescending than recognizing. It was a statement of fact. The plan was good. The way a well-built fence is a well-built fence, and for some reason Nora couldn't quite explain to herself in that moment. This straightforward acknowledgement carried a weight that exaggerated praise never could. It was the kind of respect one professional gives another. She said she would start executing it on Monday. He said that was fine. He spent another moment looking at the papers. And then he picked up the pen sitting on the desk, her pen which she had left resting on the corner of the map, and jotted a quick note in the bottom right corner of the paper. When he slid it back toward her, Nora saw it was a reference number for a vendor she had listed as unknown, written in the broad, firm handwriting of someone who doesn't worry about graphic elegance. She looked at the number. Then she looked at him. She said, "Thank you." Garrett nodded, stood up, and said, "Good night." Out in the hallway, Nora heard his footsteps on the hardwood floors, steady and firm, and then the silence of the house returning to its normal rhythm. She kept looking at the number in the corner of the map for a while longer, holding that pen in her hand, feeling an undefined sensation she made no attempt to name. The weeks that followed established a routine that, by virtue of consistent repetition, began to take on a quality different from the merely professional. There was work and structure and an enormous amount of things to get done that was real and dominant and unchanging. But there was also, in the space surrounding the work, in the gaps between one task and another, a texture of companionship that grew with the silent determination of a plant after a rainstorm. Nora and Garrett had different rhythms that, out of the practical necessity of the ranch, had become complementary. She arrived early and worked best in the morning, when the air was cool and her mind rested. He spent his mornings out with the hands, checking cattle, overseeing jobs, making the kind of physical and immediate decisions a large ranch demands from its owner, and arrived at the office after lunch, when she had advanced enough to have concrete material to discuss. There wasn't much room for conversation that wasn't about the ranch, and by tacit agreement neither of them tried to force that room. But the ranch, being what it was, a living organism with its own history, with dozens of details that mattered and shifted every day, always found a way to expand the conversation beyond pure numbers. It was on an afternoon in April that the episode with the feed supplier happened. Garrett came into the office that day wearing an expression different from his usual one. It wasn't exactly worry, it was heavier, less mobile, the face of someone carrying an irritation they hadn't yet decided how to resolve. He sat down and stared at the papers in front of him, without really seeing them for a few seconds. Nora, working on her side of the desk, noticed but said nothing. She waited. After a moment, he said that one of their main feed suppliers had sent a notice declaring a 20% price hike, with no advance warning and no formal justification. He said this was their primary supplier, and changing vendors in the time frame necessary to avoid impacting the herd's feeding cycle would be complicated. Nora sat quietly for a second. Then she asked if he had the original contract with this supplier. He said he did. She asked to see it. Garrett opened the right-hand drawer of the desk. She had noticed he possessed a spatial memory of exactly where everything was kept, even when the stacks looked devoid of a system, and pulled out a 3-page contract folded in half. He slid it across the desk. Nora picked it up and read it with the total focus she applied to everything ranch-related. A minute and 40 seconds later, she looked up with a trace of something very close to satisfaction. There was an escalation clause in the contract, but it wasn't the clause the supplier was invoking to justify the hike. It was a different one, older and far more specific, which capped any unilateral increase at a maximum of 5% annually, requiring a 30-day prior written notice. The supplier was acting as if this clause simply didn't exist, or banking on the client not finding it buried in the fine print of a 3-page document. Nora placed the open contract on the desk, turned to the right page, and tapped the paragraph with the tip of her pencil. Garrett leaned forward to look. He read for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do up until then. He let out a short, brief sound, halfway between a sigh and a suppressed laugh, and gave his head a small shake with the exact expression of a man annoyed by someone else's dishonesty, but pleased that it had been caught. He asked if she had just found that reading it now, on the spot, she said yes. Garrett looked at her for a moment, with that direct attention that was his hallmark. Then he said he would take care of it that very day, and stood up. But before walking out, with his hand already on the doorknob, he turned slightly and said, in that measured voice that treated important things as if they were mundane, that she had her father's exact touch with contracts. Nora froze. She asked how he knew about her father. Garrett turned all the way back, and on his face right then was the slight awareness of having revealed more than he had planned. He said he had made some inquiries before hiring her, that Arthur Lewis had a small but rock-solid reputation in the county, and that there was someone who knew his work and had vouched that the daughter had inherited the talent. The office went quiet for a moment. Nora felt those words land in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't anything extraordinary. It was just information. It was just the fact that he had gone through the trouble of asking about her father before deciding to hire her. But the way he said it, with that brevity that was his way of treating the things that actually mattered, touched something she made no attempt to analyze. She simply said her father would be happy to know that. Garrett nodded once and walked out. Nora kept looking at the door for a while after his footsteps faded down the hall. Outside the office, the life of the ranch happened in parallel to the work of numbers, rich with all the specific details places like this possess. There were the ranch hands arriving before sunrise, the mooing of cattle that marked the corral schedule with biological clockwork precision, the smell of beans wafting up from Josephine's kitchen at 10 in the morning, like an infallible olfactory alarm. There was the afternoon rain that fell almost every day in March and April, heavy and generous, flooding the office's large window with the scent of wet earth, mingling with the smell of paper and ink in a way Nora discovered, much to her own surprise, she loved dearly. There were the wildflowers blooming at the pasture's edge, splashing color across the prairie with the specific generosity of things that know their bloom will be short and therefore go all out. Nora, who had spent the last 2 years in an Amarillo boarding house with a window facing a brick wall, would sometimes pause her work to look out the office window, struck by just how much space existed out here. It wasn't just physical acreage, though that was vast. It was a different quality to the air, more open, more real, that made her mind work in ways she had forgotten were possible. It was on one of those afternoons of heavy rain that the second chair on the porch entered the story in the most natural yet unexpected way possible. Nora had finished a report earlier than expected that afternoon, and while walking down the main hall toward her room to fetch another file, she heard the rain drumming hard and steady on the roof. She felt that specific urge to just stand and watch the water fall, an urge anyone who grew up in the country knows by heart. She stopped at the door leading to the porch, and Garrett was already there, sitting in the right-hand rocking chair, holding a mug of coffee in both hands, his gaze lost in the rain falling like a dense, white curtain over the front yard, erasing the line between pasture and sky in a beautiful uniform grey. She should have said good afternoon and kept walking. Any reasonable person would have done so. It was the proper thing, the simple thing, the thing their day one agreement implicitly suggested. But the rain was beautiful in a specific way that afternoon, with distant thunder rolling every so often as the backdrop to something grander. And the second chair was right there, completely empty, and there was a quality of stillness over everything that served as an unspoken invitation. She said, "Good afternoon." Garrett said, "Good afternoon." Nora sat down in the left-hand chair. They sat in silence for a long time, both watching the rain. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of two people who don't know what to say. It was the other kind, the kind that exists between people who don't need to fill the air to prove they are present for one another. Nora hadn't experienced that kind of silence in a very long time. Perhaps never, not in this specific way. Josephine appeared in the doorway a little later, dry and solid with her apron folded, and offered coffee. Nora said yes. When the cook returned with 2 cups on saucers, Nora noticed something incredibly subtle on her face as she set them down on the armrests. Not quite a smile, but the idea of one, guarded with the care of someone who knows certain things are far too fragile to be touched before their time. They stayed on the porch until the rain stopped, which took 40-something minutes. They spoke little, mostly about practical things. A leak in the barn roof that would need attention before the next downpour, Old Man Jeb's weather forecast for the coming month, a fence giving way on the northern boundary. Ranch matters, useful things. But there was a different quality to that conversation, a lightness that their office talks, direct, focused, utilitarian, lacked. It was looser, more human, the kind of conversation that is in no rush to end. When the rain stopped and the sun peeked back over the horizon at a low angle, casting that soft golden glow, typical of a prairie evening, Garrett stood up, said goodnight, and went inside. Nora stayed in her chair a moment longer, entirely alone, holding her empty cup as the smell of wet earth rose from the yard. She didn't try to overthink what that had been. She just let it exist. In the days that followed, the work continued with all its concrete urgency. Nora was implementing the financial recovery plan, and every week brought a new hurdle, a new renegotiation, a new detail demanding immediate attention. The feed supplier had backed down when confronted with the contract clause, but not before attempting an argument that held absolutely zero weight when put in writing. Nora countered it in writing, utilizing the precision and economy of words that were her signature in such moments. Garrett read her response before it was mailed, made only one small correction to a paragraph that was technically perfect but a bit too harsh in tone, and said it was good to go. The letter went out. A specific order established itself in the way they worked together without ever needing to be discussed. Garrett made the final calls. It was his name on the deed, his ranch, his responsibility. But it had reached a point where he consulted Nora before any decision involving numbers, and he genuinely listened to what she had to say before deciding. Not out of courtesy, but because she had proven, week after week, that her words were worth hearing. When she was right, he acknowledged it. When he disagreed, he told her exactly why. And when they reached a conclusion together, it was exactly that. A conclusion molded by both their hands. This specific respect, tangible, demonstrated in actions rather than declarations, started doing something inside Nora that she only noticed peripherally, like catching movement out of the corner of your eye without turning your head. Are you enjoying this story? If you are, do me a favor that is truly priceless, like this video right now. It goes a long way in bringing this story to more people who deserve to hear a good love story. Stay with me here. It was in late May that things from the outside began knocking on the inside doors. Uncle Amos arrived on a Friday afternoon without warning, which was his usual way of arriving, acting as though the world should naturally adjust to his schedule and not the other way around. He was Garrett's father's brother, a man in his early 60s with a meticulously groomed white mustache and the prosperous, absolutely confident demeanor of someone who had never needed to doubt himself because life's circumstances had never forced him to. He rode in from Dallas on a fine horse, carrying a saddlebag that indicated a stay of more than one day. Garrett welcomed him on the porch with the restrained, genuine affection he reserved for people he actually cared about. That was how he showed fondness, not with many words or dramatic gestures, but with real attention that was better than any speech. They embraced briefly, and Amos walked into the house with the stride of a man who feels at home anywhere he frequents regularly. Nora met him at dinner that night. Garrett introduced her briefly, using that conciseness he applied to things requiring no further elaboration. He simply stated she was the ranch's new bookkeeper and manager. Amos looked her over with the quick, sharp eyes of someone rapidly calculating what he was seeing, extended his hand with a socially flawless smile, and harbored a question mark he chose not to verbalize right then. He did verbalize it the next day, in a conversation with his nephew. Nora wasn't present. She heard about it later through fragments Josephine couldn't entirely keep to herself, not out of gossip, but out of the cook's genuine concern for what she saw unfolding. Amos had said he found the situation highly unorthodox. He said having a young unmarried woman living and working in the main house was going to cause talk across the county, that there was an order to how things were done, and that Garrett was at the perfect age to reconsider the Prescott family, that their eldest, Rose, was a fine girl from a known family, and it would be a sensible match, the kind that made sense for everybody. What Garrett replied, Nora never knew for sure. But she knew the conversation had happened, and she knew it by the way he walked into the office that afternoon, carrying a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He worked in silence beside her for a long time, mentioning neither his uncle nor the visit. Nora didn't ask. It wasn't her place to ask. But there was something in that silence. She felt like a shift in the air's temperature, discreet but undeniably real to someone accustomed to that specific atmosphere. What she knew was this: she had come to this ranch under a clear agreement, work and nothing else, and she had honored that agreement in every action and deed, without exception. But there was also something that had grown in that office, on that porch, through those long afternoons of shared labor, in the spaces between things which no longer fit entirely into the category of what had been agreed upon. She hadn't named it because naming things is dangerous in that highly specific way. Things become complicated once spoken aloud. So she left it unnamed, but she knew it was there. There were days when this knowledge was more present than others. There was the day they were reviewing a supply contract together, and he pointed out a detail in the text with his pen, his wrist resting on the desk near the paper she was holding. There was a proximity there so simple yet so charged that she had to consciously focus just to keep hearing what he was saying about the contract. There were the afternoons he came in from the range, his hat coated in trail dust and his face marked by the sun, and he would just walk straight to the office chair and start working without ceremony. There was something in the utter naturalness of it, in how they both occupied that space as if they had always occupied it together, that Nora sometimes found difficult to look at directly without something inside her, shifting for a while afterward. There were also the times he disagreed with her, not the work disagreements, which were frequent, healthy, and which she actually enjoyed because they forged better solutions. There was another kind of disagreement that was rarer, more personal, when he disagreed with how she viewed something about the ranch as a place rather than a business. During those moments, there was an earnestness to their debates unlike any other conversation, as if both knew they were discussing something far more important than it appeared. She hadn't named any of it, but she knew. Amos stayed for an entire week. During that week, the afternoons on the porch did not happen. The work was strictly the work, carrying all the formality the original agreement demanded, which the uncle's presence somehow forcibly restored. Nora noticed the difference in the silence of the afternoons, but she said nothing. On the night before Amos was set to leave, she was in the office working late when she heard voices in the hall. They were low voices, a late-night talk. She didn't want to listen, but her name came up, distinct enough to reach her where she sat, and she froze, her pen suspended over the ledger. Amos was saying she was clearly a young woman of fine character and real capability. He understood that. But there was an order to things that existed for good reasons, and Garrett needed to think not just about the ranch, but about himself, about what he needed for his life ahead, about what was expected of a man of his standing and family. Garrett gave a short reply in that low voice of his. The words didn't reach her clearly. Amos said he only wanted what was best for his nephew, that he always had. Garrett said he knew that. And then there were footsteps, doors closing, and the nocturnal silence of the house settling back in. Nora sat perfectly still, pen in hand, staring at the numbers on the page without seeing them for a very long time. There was something deeply unsettling about hearing her own situation treated as a problem to be managed by other people, as if her presence there was a complication requiring resolution. It wasn't exactly anger. It was something deeper, the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent her entire life having to prove a worth that should have simply been recognized, and who sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, feels the accumulated weight of all the years she'd spent doing it. She took a deep breath. She straightened her back. She went back to the numbers. That was what she knew how to do. She knew how to do it well, and no one could ever take that from her. Amos left early the next morning, taking his fine horse and that air of someone who had said his piece and left the rest to time. He bid Nora farewell with impeccable cordiality and a look that said far more than his words, just as it always had. When the sound of hoofbeats faded down the road, Garrett stood silently on the porch for a moment. Nora appeared in the doorway holding a document that required his signature, a pending renegotiation that couldn't wait, and asked if it was a good time. He turned to her, and his expression held something she couldn't immediately name. The look of a man, halfway through a decision he hasn't completely finalized. He said yes, it was. And they went into the office. That same month in June, Nora discovered, while tracking an offer by mail to buy a portion of their herd, that the rancher on the other end was Silas Garner, the very same man who had hired Ernest Vance after his abrupt departure from Whispering Winds. The offer itself looked reasonable on the surface, offering prices that seemed fair at first glance. But there was something in its structure that bothered Nora in a way it took her 2 days to precisely articulate. When she finally did, she laid it out for Garrett like this. The offer targeted the exact lot of cattle that was the ranch's most profitable, at a price that appeared fair but was actually below market value for that specific category of livestock at that exact time. If Garrett sold, it would solve a very real short-term cash flow pressure, but it would cripple the precise part of the operation acting as the engine for the recovery she had plotted out. It was like selling your heart to pay the doctor's bill. Garrett listened with total attention. He sat quietly for a moment. Then he said the name, Ernest. Nora said that was what she believed. There was a cold restraint in his expression that she had learned, over their weeks together, meant far more than explicit anger. He said he wasn't going to sell. She told him there was an alternative for the short-term cash flow problem. It was more labor-intensive, requiring careful renegotiations with 2 different suppliers, but it was viable and wouldn't sacrifice the primary herd. Garrett said he wanted to hear it. They stayed in the office until the sun vanished that night, working. Josephine brought them supper without being asked. She simply appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 plates, setting them on the desk, with the natural grace of someone who understands when people need to eat but haven't realized it yet. and then vanished again. Nora and Garrett ate while working, like two people who had forgotten they were eating because they were occupied with something far more important in that moment. When they finally left the office, it was nearly midnight. The hallway was dark except for the kerosene lamp Nora carried. Garrett said the renegotiation she proposed was solid and that they would start drafting the letters in the morning. And then he said with that brevity she had learned to hear beyond the spoken words that the ranch was lucky to have her. Nora didn't answer immediately. Something about it landed differently than the other times he had praised her work. Maybe because of the late hour, the utter silence of the sleeping house around them, or the dim lamplight making everything feel a bit more intimate than the daylight allowed. She said, after a pause that stretched slightly longer than usual, that the feeling was mutual. Garrett looked at her for a second longer than necessary in the dim glow of the hall. Then he said goodnight and went to his room. Nora stood in the dark hallway for a moment, holding the lamp, feeling her heart pound in a way that was impossible to attribute entirely to the exhaustion of a long night's work. July arrived on the plains with that dry, clean chill that creeps in before dawn and vanishes by noon, leaving the air crystal clear, the sun glaring white, and that specific scent of a sun-baked prairie, entirely different from a rain-soaked one. It was more mineral, more direct, as if the world had shed a soft layer to become more honest. The ranch work pushed on, the numbers improved with the consistency of something being properly cared for. And something else was happening in the spaces between practical matters, which also carried the quality of being well cared for without anyone having actively decided to care for it. The cup of coffee was the first concrete thing she noticed. On a morning in mid-July, she arrived at the office at her usual time, before the sun, while the house was still caught in the blue silence of dawn. The desk was exactly as they had left it the evening before, papers in their places and ledgers marked where she had left off. But on the right corner of the desk, where her stack of morning processing documents usually sat, there was a cup of coffee. It was still hot when she touched it, hot in a way that meant it had been poured less than 10 minutes ago. There was no one in the office. She walked to the kitchen. Josephine was just lighting the wood stove, moving with the methodical grace of someone who had done it every day for years. Nora asked if she had brought coffee to the office. The cook replied she hadn't, wearing an expression completely neutral on the surface, but holding a layer beneath it that anyone paying attention could easily read. There was no other explanation besides the obvious one. Nora walked back to the office, sat in her chair, and drank the coffee slowly. It was good, brewed exactly the way she liked it, a very specific way she had only mentioned once, in passing, during a conversation about something else entirely. She didn't say anything about it. Garrett didn't say anything about it. But the next morning, there was another cup, and the next. And soon it was every morning, always hot, always in the same corner, always sitting there before he showed up for his day's work, as if it were simply part of the routine. A thing that had always been done and required no commentary. Then there was the book. Nora had mentioned once, just once, in passing while they were reorganizing the archive shelves, that her father owned a very old accounting textbook from the late 1800s that she had loved since she was a little girl. Not for the technical content, which she already knew, but for the way the author wrote, with a clarity that turned dry, arid subjects into something almost literary, almost alive. She had brought it up the way one mentions a fond memory, expecting nothing to come of it. 3 weeks later, she found that very book on the office bookshelf. It hadn't been there before. She knew every volume on those shelves, with the familiarity of someone who lived alongside them daily. There was no note, nothing written anywhere inside. The book had simply appeared, placed at a slightly different angle than the others, like something recently added. She pulled it out slowly, opening it to the first page. It smelled of old bindings and something else, of paper that had travelled, of hands that had turned its pages before hers. She stood in front of the bookshelf for a long time, unable to pinpoint exactly what she was feeling. There was joy, she was certain of that, but there was also something closer to fright, because joy so specific and unexpected sometimes feels like danger in disguise when you aren't used to it. That afternoon, when Garrett walked into the office, she told him she had found the book. She just said that, with no further details, and looked at him. He said he had passed through Dallas the weekend prior, that there was a used bookstore in an alley near the market he knew about. He said it with a completely calm voice, as if reporting a stray piece of information, as if he had just happened to be in Dallas by chance. The book had coincidentally materialized in the shop, and he had simply bought it without thinking much of it. Nora said it was very kind of him. Garrett nodded and opened the day's paperwork. But there was a slightly different hue to his face right then, very faint, almost imperceptible. But she had spent months learning Garrett Drummond's face with the involuntary attention of someone who cannot stop looking, and she knew how to distinguish his habitual expressions from variations. This was a variation. There was something there he kept guarded, but it existed. She didn't say anything about that either. In August, news broke that Silas Garner had struck a partnership with a major cattle buyer out of Chicago, the kind of deal that shifts the pricing dynamics of an entire region and redistributes negotiating power in ways that take time to become visible, but run incredibly deep once they do. For Whispering Winds, which was recovering but still in a delicate spot, this was pressure, not an immediate catastrophe, but the ground shifting beneath their feet right when they needed stability most. Nora found out before Garrett did, hearing it from a foreman returning from a livestock auction. She listened, thanked him, and spent an hour thinking before saying a word. Because there was a potential answer to this problem, and she had begun prepping it 3 weeks prior, using the exact same logic that had led her to flag June's suspicious offer. The cash flow crunch Silas's maneuver could create was entirely predictable if you watched the board closely enough. When Garrett arrived that afternoon, and she delivered the news, she presented it with a different kind of clarity. Not just laying out the problem, but serving up the answer alongside it. There was a buyer operating out of Chicago, specializing in a premium grade of cattle that Whispering Winds produced, which Silas's herd couldn't match in quality. She had reached out to this buyer by letter 3 weeks ago on her own initiative, precisely because she had foreseen something like this coming, and that buyer had written back with genuine interest. Garrett sat in silence for a moment. Then he asked when she had made contact. She said 3 weeks ago. He kept looking at her with an expression far more open than usual, as if a layer of restraint had given way unannounced. He asked why she had done it without mentioning it. She said she hadn't known if it would be necessary, and she hadn't wanted to float a possibility without first verifying if the other party was truly interested, that she preferred having something concrete before speaking. Garrett stayed quiet a moment longer, and then he said something she didn't expect. He said that was exactly how his father used to run things. Verify first, speak later. He said it in a way that wasn't a comparison, it was a memory. It was a man gently opening a door that had long been locked tight. Nora asked, with the care one reserves for fragile things, if his father had passed away a long time ago. Garrett said it had been almost 10 years. He said the ranch had been bigger before, that there were hard years afterward, that he had taken the reins too early without knowing half of what he needed to know, that he had learned a lot by messing up. He said this with the calm of someone who has digested what needed digesting and can now recite it as fact, without apparent pain, but carrying the gravity of a man who knows the heavy weight of what he's describing. It was the most personal conversation they'd had since she arrived. Nora felt the weight of it in a way that didn't feel heavy. It was the kind of weight that cracks something closed open just enough to let a sliver of light through. She said her father was like that too, that she had learned from him not only what ledgers taught, but what an honest man demonstrates simply by living in a very specific way. That there were days she still picked up a pen and, for a fraction of a second, expected him to appear in the doorway and ask how it was going. The office fell into a silence different from all the others, more intimate, more shared, the kind that settles when two people realize they hold something in common they never planned on holding. Garrett said after a while that he understood that perfectly. Neither of them said anything more about their fathers that day. They went back to work, but something in the space between them had shifted, as subtle and irreversible as the changing of a season that you don't notice day by day, but look back on and realize the world looks entirely different than it used to. There were also the little things that kept piling up unceremoniously, like grains of sand in a jar, filling up without anyone announcing when it crossed the halfway mark. There was the afternoon she spent hours searching for a 1921 record she needed to close an analysis, unable to find it anywhere in the archive shelves. She searched systematically, top to bottom, left to right, twice over. On the third time, standing before the shelf with the look of someone starting to suspect the document simply didn't exist, she heard Garrett say from the doorway that it was probably in the wooden crate under the window, behind the oak boards. Because his father had kept the 1919 through 1922 records in a separate box that was never transferred to the main shelves. Nora walked to the window, lifted the lid of the wooden crate that had been sitting there the entire time without her knowing, and there was the ledger. She stared at it for a moment, then looked over at Garrett. She asked if he had known where it was the whole time. He said he had. She asked why he hadn't spoken up sooner. Garrett stood in silence for a second, wearing that expression that was sometimes hard to fully decode. He said he had enjoyed watching her look for it, that she had a very specific way about her when she was laser-focused on solving something, and that it was an interesting thing to observe. The office became exceedingly quiet for a moment. Nora said, using a voice she managed to keep much more neutral than the heart beating beneath it, that next time he could simply tell her where the document was. Garrett said that was fair, and went back to what he was doing. But there was a tug at the corner of his mouth she saw clearly this time. It wasn't an almost smile. It was a smile. Quick and restrained, but a smile. She carried the ledger back to her desk and spent 20 minutes working on it, entirely unable to say for sure how many times she reread the exact same paragraph without processing a single word. There was also the night of the heavy rainstorm with gale-force winds, which tore a massive branch from the pecan tree in the backyard, making enough noise to wake everyone in the house. Nora woke to the crash, listened for a moment, and then got up to see what had happened, not because she knew what to do with a fallen branch, but because she was the type of person who needed to see things with her own eyes. She walked barefoot down the hall and found Garrett already in the yard holding a lantern, evaluating the downed timber without apparent concern. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked, and the air held that intense freshness left behind by a severe storm. The lantern he held cast a circle of yellow light around them both in the middle of the dark yard. They stood evaluating the branch for a few minutes. There was no real damage. The pecan was sturdy, and the wood had fallen well clear of the buildings. Garrett said he'd have some men chop it up and clear it out in the morning. Nora remarked that it was a terribly large branch to have gone unnoticed for so long. Garrett said that sometimes things grow in the dark without us noticing, right up until they fall. There was a double meaning in all of this that neither of them pretended not to notice right then. Standing in the wet yard, smelling of rain and earth, cocooned in that circle of lamplight. They stood in silence for a moment longer than the fallen branch required. And then Garrett said they had better head back inside, since the ground was drenched. So they went back inside. But neither of them slept very well the rest of that night, each in their respective rooms, listening to the rain that returned much softer after midnight, serving as the backdrop to thoughts that asked no permission to exist. The meeting with the buyer from Chicago took place in September. Bennett Cole was a young man for his position, practical and quick to evaluate, carrying the demeanor of someone who closes a deal when the deal is good and wastes no time when it isn't. Garrett welcomed him and gave him the tour of the herd. Nora stayed in the office with the ledgers, ready for when the conversation inevitably turned to the financials. When the two men walked into the office, Bennett looked at Nora with the quick surprise of someone recalibrating an expectation and having absolutely no problem doing so. He remarked that he had assumed he would be discussing terms with Mr. Drummond. Garrett said, with all the naturalness in the world, that the terms were to be discussed with Nora, as she was the one who ran the ranch's books. There was something in that brevity, in the way he said it without hesitating, without qualifying it, without feeling any need to explain more than was strictly necessary, as if it were the most obvious and natural thing on earth, that Nora felt settle somewhere in her chest, like something solid and warm. It was the kind of gesture worth far more than any grand speech. The negotiation went well. They reached an agreement in 2.5 hours, laying out terms that were incredibly favorable for Whispering Winds in a way Nora could precisely quantify. It solved the cash flow crisis Silas's maneuver had threatened, opened a brand new sales channel immune to regional price fluctuations, and gave the ranch an entirely different bargaining position for the coming year. When Bennett Cole left and the sound of his motorcar faded down the red dirt road, Garrett and Nora stood in the front yard for a moment. It was a late September afternoon, the sun casting a bronze glow low on the horizon, the air smelling of dry earth and prairie grass. It was the specific satisfaction of having worked together toward something real and having it succeed. Garrett said it was a job well done. Nora said it had been good work from both of them. He looked at her, and in that look, bathed in the bronze light of late September, with the vast silence of the plains all around them, there was a quality completely different from all his previous looks. It was more direct, more open, as if a layer of something that had been sitting there for months had been stripped away without anyone deciding to remove it. Nora felt something shift inside her with a clarity that could no longer be ignored. She didn't say anything. Garrett didn't say anything either, but something had crossed between them in that instant, and both of them knew it had crossed. They went inside in silence. Josephine, who had watched the whole thing from the kitchen window with eyes that missed absolutely nothing, turned back to her stove, holding on to a guarded non-smile that was as expressive as any monologue. October rolled in with a shift in rhythm that Nora only identified after the fact, looking back with the necessary distance. The work continued with its usual urgency. But something in the space surrounding the work had changed temperatures, much like the air before a thunderstorm feels different, more charged, more present, more acutely aware of itself. The porch afternoons continued whenever it rained, which was frequent in October. It had simply become a thing that existed. Nora would finish her tasks, walk down the hall, and if it was raining, Garrett would be in the right-hand chair holding a hot mug. She would sit in the left. Sometimes there was conversation, sometimes silence, sometimes a blend of both in the natural way things blend between people who know each other well enough to not need to fill the void between them. What had changed was something in the intervals. In the way Garrett sometimes paused before answering a question, as if the response he had ready was no longer exactly the one he wanted to give. In the way Nora would occasionally catch herself thinking about something he had said hours later, turning the words over in her mind, searching for a second meaning that perhaps wasn't there, or perhaps most certainly was. There were also the disagreements, a legitimate and frequent part of two strong-minded professionals working side by side, but they had acquired a new quality. Before, they were direct and technical, ending in a solution. Now, they sometimes started out technical and veered into something closer to a debate on how to view the world, on what kind of risks were worth taking, on what it meant to be careful versus what it meant to be timid. And these discussions carried an energy that was impossible to classify as purely professional without playing the fool. On a warm October afternoon, they argued at length over the herd expansion strategy for the following year. Garrett wanted to move slowly, with genuine caution, given the fragile months they had just survived. Nora argued that the window of opportunity with the Chicago buyer was highly specific and temporary, and that failing to advance while they could was just as risky as advancing too fast. Both were right, and both knew the other was right. It was one of those cases where the challenge wasn't finding out who was correct, but deciding which risk was more acceptable. The argument grew heated. At one point, they were both standing on opposite sides of the desk, Nora lightly tapping her palm against the paper full of numbers to emphasize a point, and Garrett shaking his head with that closed expression she had learned to perfectly distinguish from stubbornness. It wasn't stubbornness, it was the deep consideration process of a man who doesn't decide quickly because he knows the weight of his choices. At some point, she told him with more fire than she had planned that he was so worried about what he might lose that he couldn't even see what he stood to gain. There was a pause. Garrett looked at her, and there was something in his expression completely unlike any look she had spent months learning to read on his face. It was personal. It was something that had crawled out from underneath the professional veneer and was standing right there, visible for a moment. He said, in a voice slightly lower than his usual tone, that sometimes it was incredibly hard to separate one from the other. The office went dead silent. Nora realized with absolute crystal clarity the double meaning in those words. There was the argument about the herd, and there was this other thing that had slipped into the words without anyone planning or asking for it. She felt her heart do something entirely unprofessional. Then she said, after a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, that she agreed, and that perhaps the solution was a true middle ground. Expand at a smaller proportion than she proposed, but bolder than what he wanted, and reevaluate the following quarter with the data in hand. Garrett said that was reasonable, and they went back to work. But something had been said in that office that afternoon that hung in the air like the scent of wildflowers after the petals drop. The flowers themselves are no longer in sight, but the air remains heavy with them, and anyone passing through knows. The real crisis hit on a Monday in November, and it came from two sides simultaneously, with the precise timing of things that do not happen by accident. The first side was a legal notice. A lawyer hired by Silas Garner had formally contested one of the contract renegotiations Nora had finalized in August. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the renegotiation itself. It had been handled with total correctness. But the formal contestation had the power to freeze the ranch's cash flow while the litigation dragged on, and the timing was surgical. November was a month of heavy payouts, and a freeze at this specific moment could push Whispering Winds into a position of real fragility, potentially forcing them to liquidate assets. It was Ernest, once again. It was Ernest's hand inside Silas's glove, using the legal system as an extortion tool, just as he had used the ledgers as an embezzlement tool, not forcefully, but with calculated specificity. The second side was far more personal. Uncle Amos had returned, this time carrying a letter, a formal letter from the Prescott family that was, in practice, an ultimatum disguised as elegance. There was another suitor for Rose, and the family required an answer from Garrett within 30 days, so they could reply to the other party honestly. Nora found out about the legal trouble first, when the mail arrived that morning. She found out about the letter by accident that afternoon, when Amos ran into her in the hallway and told her, with all the cordiality in the world, that he hoped her work at the ranch had been highly useful to his nephew, and that things seemed to be heading toward a fine resolution for everyone involved. She understood exactly what was being said. Amos wasn't being malicious. He never was. He was being clear, in the direct manner of someone who believes clarity is a form of respect. The message was that her role there had an expiration date, and that date was being forced by outside pressure. That night, Nora lay awake in her room, the window open to the prairie night, listening to the distant croak of frogs and the wind rustling the peach trees in the yard with a soft, constant sigh. She thought with the total honesty that was her most fundamental trait, more than her math skills, more than her pride, more than anything else that defined her, about what had happened in the month she'd been there. She had arrived under a clear agreement, and she had honored that agreement in every deed and action. But there was also something that had grown outside those deeds and actions, in the space between them, in the unexplained cups of coffee, the book found on the shelf, the rainy afternoons on the porch, the September look in the yard, the October words carrying a double meaning. It was something real, possessing the weight and texture of real things, not imagined ones. And there was the reality that she was the employee and he was the boss, and there was the weight of family and the world that existed completely independent of how she felt. So, what to do? Nora lay awake a very long time with that question, and she arrived, as she always did when faced with difficult problems, not at an emotional answer, but at a clear view of what was true. What was true was this. She couldn't control what Garrett felt or what Garrett decided. She could only control what she did, and what she was going to do was solve the legal problem as efficiently as she could, protect the ranch with everything she had, and let the rest, the part that wasn't work, the part that had grown in the dark like roots spreading before they break the soil, exist without forcing it, but without denying it either. Because real things have a habit of finding their way, and pretending they don't exist doesn't make them vanish. It only makes them grow in the dark until there is no room left to pretend. The next morning she was in the office at 5:30. She spent the next 3 days working on the legal counter-argument with an intensity she herself had never experienced, with such clarity of purpose. There was a solution buried in there. She could feel it before she found it, the exact same way her father said he could feel a hidden error in a ledger before he located it. The solution rested in 2 places that needed connecting: a highly specific clause in an August contract drafted in a very particular way, and a formal correspondence log from July, documenting an agreement Silas's lawyer was either ignoring or praying no one would find. On the 3rd day at 4 in the afternoon, she had what she needed. It wasn't perfect. Legal solutions rarely are. But it was rock solid enough to make the injunction too costly for the initiator to pursue, especially considering the contested process had been executed flawlessly. She called Garrett into the office. She explained it all, document by document, taking her time and omitting nothing. He listened without interrupting once, offering the total concentration that was his trademark when something was truly serious, his body leaning slightly forward, his eyes tracking every paper she pointed to, the expression on his sun-weathered face entirely present. When she finished, he sat in silence for a very long moment. Then he asked if she was certain. She said she was. Garrett stayed quiet a moment longer, and then he did something she hadn't anticipated. He stood up from the chair, walked to the window, and stood looking out at the pasture for a moment, both arms resting on the sill. When he turned back around, his expression held something beyond anything she had ever seen on his face. It was the look of a man who had reached the absolute limit of holding something back for too long, and who had finally decided to stop holding it back. He said he needed to tell her something. Nora stayed quiet. He said that when she first arrived, they had an agreement, that the agreement was clear, and he had spent months believing it was enough. That he had tried to keep it as the truth because it was easier, because there were good reasons for it to stay the truth, because he had convinced himself he needed it to stay the truth. He stopped. He stood looking at her with that direct gaze that was Garrett Drummond's defining feature, a gaze that never flinched, that never pretended to be anything it wasn't. He said he couldn't do it anymore. The office went completely silent. Outside, the November wind rustled the trees with that soft sigh the prairie wind carries right before a storm, heavy with the promise of rain. The afternoon light poured through the tall window, golden and warm, heating up the scent of paper and kerosene that defined the room. Nora felt her heart hammer with a force that was terrifying and absolutely right at the same time, the way right things sometimes scare us because we aren't used to them being so painfully clear. She said, in the quiet but unshakable voice of the moments that truly matter, that she couldn't do it anymore either. Garrett walked over to her. They stood on opposite sides of the desk for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. And then he reached across the wood and took her hand. Simply that, the large, warm hand of a man who had spent years carrying a ranch on his own, wrapping his fingers around the hand of a woman who had spent years carrying numbers and pride and the aching memory of her father, on a November afternoon smelling of dirt and incoming rain. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic gestures. Just two adults in an office with the ranch's history lining the walls, the afternoon light spilling through the glass, and a choice made without unnecessary words, in the profoundly honest way true choices are made. Josephine was walking down the hall at that exact moment, carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. She paused for a fraction of a second when she saw the two figures through the half-open door, bathed in the afternoon light. And then she kept walking, wearing a smile she finally didn't bother keeping to herself. What came next wasn't simple, because real things never are, nor should they be. There was Amos and the Prescott letter. There was Silas's legal dispute. There was the ranch, which still needed running and wouldn't stop needing it just because two hearts had finally reached an understanding. There was the entire world that existed prior to that moment, and that would continue existing after it. Garrett wrote to his uncle that very night. Not with long words. He wasn't the type to use long words for the things that mattered. He stated he had made a decision, and he would inform the Prescott family with all due respect that he had no interest. He wrote that there was something at Whispering Winds worth far more than what was expected of him, and he hoped his uncle, in time, would come to understand. The legal dispute was thrown out 2 weeks later. The defense Nora had built was too airtight, and the cost of proceeding was too steep for men using it merely as a pressure tactic. Silas backed down without ceremony, the way men do when they realize the ground hasn't caved as they expected, and the cost of pushing forward is no longer worth the prize. Ernest Vance vanished from Silas's employ shortly thereafter. Where he went, no one could say for certain. Life moves on for everyone, in directions we don't always get to see. Amos answered his nephew's letter 2 weeks later with a reply that was a mix of genuine disappointment and reluctant acceptance. Read carefully between the lines. It revealed that the uncle loved the nephew far more deeply than he loved any set of expectations. He wrote that Garrett had always been as stubborn as his father, that he prayed the boy knew what he was doing, and that, if he did, he'd better be truly happy. Garrett read the end of the letter out loud to Nora that afternoon. the two of them sitting on the porch with Josephine's coffee as the November sun dipped toward the horizon. And for the first time in months, perhaps years, he truly laughed upon hearing the comparison to his father, a short, genuine laugh that she tucked away the way one saves things meant to be remembered forever. Nora said she thought Uncle Amos had more wisdom than he let on. Garrett said he thought so too now. And they sat on the porch, their hands resting near each other, watching the sun vanish on that November evening. The plains around them were showing the first signs that the rains were returning, that hint of green appearing at the tips of the dry grass, promising the world would renew itself once again, just as it always had, regardless of whatever happened within it. Christmas that year at Whispering Winds was the first Garrett hadn't spent alone in 5 years. Amos was there, arriving this time without an ultimatum letter, carrying a bottle of fine pre-prohibition bourbon and the demeanor of a man who had reached a conclusion he hadn't yet spoken aloud, but had accepted internally. Josephine was there, presenting a feast that had been perfuming the house since 6 in the morning, filling the rooms with the scent of spices, roasted meats and sweet pies, the unmistakable smell of celebration in the country. There were ranch hands dropping by at different times to pay their respects, greeted with boundless generosity. And there was Nora, sitting at the Whispering Winds Christmas dinner table, looking exactly like someone in the right place, not as an employee, not as a manager, but as a part of the whole, a piece that had arrived from the outside and discovered it fit in a way no one could have predicted, but which was, looking back, completely inevitable. Amos, at the end of the night, full of good bourbon and Josephine's heavy supper, leaned in and muttered to his nephew, thinking Nora was far enough away not to hear, a mistake made by many who underestimated her attention, that he had to admit the girl possessed an extraordinary mind. Garrett said she did, Amos added, after a pause carrying the weight of a man swallowing something he'd fought against for a very long time, that she had other fine qualities too. Garrett simply said he knew that, and there was more joy in his voice, in that short, direct answer, than in any long-winded speech. Nora, who had heard it all from the hallway, walked into the dining room with slightly flushed cheeks, and a shine in her eyes she made no attempt to hide this time. Like this video right now if you are feeling what I am feeling, because this story still has one more beautiful thing to tell you. Garrett asked Nora to marry him on an afternoon in March of 1925, exactly 1 year after she had first walked up that avenue of ancient trees, carrying a small suitcase and immense pride. He did it in the office, where everything had started, where the agreement had been struck, where the numbers had been untangled, where the coffee had magically appeared early one morning, where the book had shown up on the shelf, where their hands had finally met on a November afternoon. He did it in the right place, the right way, with the directness that was Garrett Drummond's way of handling everything that truly mattered. He said he had thought long and hard about how to ask, and had concluded there was no better way than to simply ask. He said he loved her. He said Whispering Winds was better with her, but that was the lesser reason. The greater reason was that he was better with her, that he was a different man than he used to be, that he had learned from her that carrying things together wasn't weakness, it was the bravest way to exist. Nora looked at him for a moment that lasted as long as it needed to. And then she said yes, in the quiet, unshakable voice of the hours that mattered, and with eyes that, this time, tried to hold absolutely nothing back. They were married in June of 1925, in a simple ceremony in town, with Amos standing as a witness and Josephine wearing a new blue dress, flashing the smile of someone who had known before everyone else and had waited with the absolute patience of a person who understands that the right things arrive when they arrive, and trying to rush them is like trying to force a wildflower to bloom. The years that followed were the kind that aren't defined by dramatic moments, because they weren't made of dramatic moments. They were made of smaller, more solid things. The daily work, the decisions made as a team, the disagreements that sometimes flared but always ended in a solution better than either of them could have reached alone. They were made of afternoons on the porch, with the two chairs permanently side by side, and of mornings where the coffee kept appearing on the corner of the office desk, even after the habit no longer needed to be a secret, simply out of custom and affection. They were made of good years and hard years, because the plains have their droughts, and the market has its crashes, and life spares no one from challenges, and an unyielding constancy through it all that cannot be faked, existing only because it was built brick by brick, day by day, in the space between things. The Whispering Winds Ranch grew with the consistency of things done right. The herd expanded according to the plan drawn up on butcher paper that September afternoon with color-coded columns. The channel with the Chicago buyer became a lasting partnership that endured for years, bringing real stability. There were infrastructure improvements, new hires that made a difference, decisions that were sometimes Garrett's, sometimes Nora's, but mostly belonged to both of them, forged in that same office, smelling of paper and kerosene where it all began. There was one thing Nora kept in a private notebook, separate from the account ledgers and ranch records, which she never showed anyone during her lifetime. It was a small, black-covered notebook kept in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser, and she opened it rarely, not because what was written inside was painful, but because it was so precious she preferred visiting it with care, the way one visits a beloved place, knowing that too much frequency wears away a bit of the magic. In that notebook were entries about the days, not the ranch days, not the numbers, but the days of the heart. The afternoon she first sat in the second chair on the porch, the morning she found the hot cup of coffee, the September afternoon painted in bronze, the night of the fallen pecan branch, the circle of lantern light, and the words that meant two things at once. And on the final pages there was something she wrote many years later, in the firmer handwriting of notebooks that age alongside a life. She wrote that the greatest risk she had ever taken wasn't packing her suitcase and heading to an unknown ranch. It had been letting the other person in. It had been sitting in the second chair, uninvited, just to see what would happen. And that this risk, which had seemed terrifying at the time, had been the only thing truly worth doing. Josephine stayed at the ranch for many years, growing old there with the dignity of someone who knows she is exactly where she belongs, watching Nora and Garrett with the deep, quiet satisfaction of someone who planted a seed in secret and then watched the tree grow. She never said she had known all along. She didn't need to. Amos returned many times over the years, and at some point he completely stopped making remarks about the order of things and the right families, because it was impossible to stand on Whispering Winds soil and not see that it was in every way a ranch could be, a place where everything was exactly right. He became the uncle who showed up for the holidays, sat on the porch drinking good bourbon, talking to everyone, harboring a deep pride for his nephew that now naturally included Nora, as if it always had. On an afternoon, many years later, a March afternoon, the month everything had begun, and thus the month carrying the heaviest memories in that place, Garrett and Nora were sitting in the two chairs on the porch. The sun was setting with that bronze hue the late afternoon sun takes on over the Texas plains when the rainy season is approaching, and the air held the specific smell of earth about to be watered, which is one of the oldest and most honest smells in existence. There was an open ledger in Nora's lap. There was a cup of coffee in Garrett's hand. And between them lay the silence that exists between people who have known each other so long, that silence is the most honest conversation they can have. Garrett said, without looking at her, that there was an incorrect number in the second column of the page she was reading. Nora said there wasn't. He said there absolutely was. She said he couldn't see a single thing from that distance. he said he saw perfectly fine. She handed him the ledger with a patience that was, in truth, disguised complicity. He looked at it for a moment, wearing the spectacles he had started using a few years back, which she always told him suited his face perfectly. Then he handed the book back. He said perhaps she was right this time. Nora said yes, she was. Garrett looked at her sideways, with that trace of guarded humor she had learned to expect and love throughout all those years together, that half-smile appearing at the corner of his mouth when he was truly, deeply content. He took her hand with the natural grace of someone who has done it for so many years. He does it without thinking, doing it the way he breathes. She let him, as she always did, her fingers, which had traced so many columns of numbers and pages of contracts, intertwining with the fingers that had dragged a ranch from the bottom back into the light. The sun continued its slow, generous descent over the prairie. The wildflowers at the pasture's edge were blooming purple and gold for the season, that discreet extravagance the plains permit themselves when the time is right, as if knowing they had been patient enough through the drought to earn the beauty that follows. And the two chairs on the porch of the Whispering Winds Ranch sat there as they always had, side by side, holding the right people, as if it had always been exactly this way and could never be any other. Sometimes life starts one way and ends up in a place we never would have drawn if given the chance. Sometimes the red dirt road leading up to the gates of an unknown ranch is also the road leading to the most important thing we will ever find. Sometimes the hiring that was meant to be strictly a job, with clear agreements, set conditions, and the absolute certainty that it was nothing more, slowly turns over a cup of coffee, a book on a shelf, a rainy afternoon, a look held 2 seconds longer than necessary, into the most beautiful love story a ranch has ever held within its walls. And when love is born like that, built slowly in the space between things, without rush, without drama, and without anyone planning it, it is the kind that grows roots as deep as ancient oaks, which time cannot shake and hardship only makes stronger. It is the kind that stays, and that was exactly what stayed. For all the years at Whispering Winds that were still to come, for all the seasons on the prairie that had yet to pass, for everything life still held in store for the two of them, it stayed. Quiet, firm, built in the space between things, where true love is always built, much like Whispering Winds itself, which had survived the hardships and come out stronger, much like the plains that every drought seems to kill and every rain resurrects. Like everything that is real and has roots deep enough to withstand any storm.